Hello and welcome to Perspectives on Faith. I'm Khalif Watkins and I'll be your host for this episode. This time we'll be talking about faith and reason. Are the two necessarily at odds, or can they be complementary? Well, to help us explore this issue, we have today's guest. Dr. Youssef Yacoubi is an assistant professor of Arabic and comparative literature and also the director of the Arabic Studies program at Bard College in upstate New York. Dr. Yacoubi, welcome.
Thank you.
So, before we go into our conversation, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to Bard College?
Right. I'm originally from Morocco, and I did my undergraduate studies at Agadir University, which is the south of Morocco, and I majored in English and American studies. After that, I went to England and I did my graduate studies. I did a master's degree in literature at Essex University, and then later I did my PhD at the University of Nottingham, which is up north of England. I also did part of my training at Princeton University, and I spent 1 year as a graduate fellow at the Department of Comparative Literature. And after that, I also taught at Princeton University, I taught at Rutgers University, Hofstra University, and at the moment, since 2006, I started teaching at Bard College.
Oh, thank you. Now, 3 main countries you lived in: Morocco, England, America. Any major differences between the two that you've seen, or?
There are obviously many differences, but I think from my experience, I have basically learned and accumulated all these cultures. I still consider myself Moroccan. I'm also, I suppose, European and British, and I have been in this country since 2001, and I've learned so much. So I suppose the American experience is also part of my personality, and I suppose part of my development. So I think travel is a way of learning about yourself and a way of developing and evolving as a person, also as an academic, and also it is a way of getting to know others and getting to understand others and making sense, I suppose, of others in the world that we live in.
So when people talk about faith and reason, what exactly do they mean? I mean, how would you define these terms?
Right. I'm glad you've asked me that question, because I think it's very important to define the terms of any discussion or any debate. And this is really the root of misunderstanding or a lot of miscomprehension between interlocutors or people who try to have a conversation. It's because they don't define the terms that they are using, because they are mobilizing these terms in different ways. So it's always very important to define these terms. At the very basic level, I think if we want to provide a basic definition of faith, faith is an expression of trust in a transcendent being or a transcendent knowledge. So that's what we understand by faith. It's a belief. So in a sense, it is associated with a human sense of what is beyond the human, the transcendent.
Some greater reality beyond ourselves.
A greater reality, a transcendent reality. But on the other hand, reason is an application of certain principles of logic and method. And this is why many have argued over the centuries that there is a difference, or that these two are incompatible, that they are radically incompatible. You can never really reconcile them. Of course, historically, this has not been true. And so it is very important to stress the fact that faith is based, the idea of expressing this trust and this absolute reliance on a transcendent knowledge or a transcendent being is based on certain historical realities and certain historical facts. For example, it's based on a book. And we're talking here about the Abrahamic traditions. Right. So it is based on revelation, an event that is taken to be part of a divine history as well as a human history. So it's very important to realize that that others have argued that faith is not necessarily something outside reason. And it is in that sense that these can, in a sense, work together. And coincide and can be reconciled.
Now, I'd like to go a little bit into the whole idea of historical context, because you alluded to the idea that others have argued that the two can work together. So has the definition of faith and reason changed over time as well, or?
Indeed it has, but it is very important, I think, to point out that if we were to understand faith and reason within a particular tradition, like the Islamic tradition, we have to begin with the beginning. And the beginning, in a sense, is both the book, the idea of revelation, which is an Abrahamic notion, but on the other hand, what comes after the book, the understanding of the book. And this is where reason fits in. That is, how do we understand revelation? So to understand revelation, you need another process. In addition to faith, you need another process, and that is the process of thinking, of reasoning, of using certain principles of understanding and perception. And as far as the Quran is concerned, if we go back to the book stresses the importance of actually using reason. So it concedes that man is intelligent. Because man is intelligent, man has to use reason. He has to use his mind, and he has to use certain principles that are obviously fundamentally linguistic principles, but they are also principles of understanding and principle of making sense, going back to that point, of making sense of things, making sense especially of the world and the universe. And the Quran stresses this point because it fits in with the notion that reason is important because we human beings need to understand ourselves. That's number one. And number two, we need to understand the universe. We need to understand the order around us. So through reason, we note that this universe works and operates according to a certain structure and a certain order. And that's why reason is very important, to understand the cosmos, the universe. And in that sense, revelation, the Quran, stresses the importance of using reason as another fundamental and essential intellectual form of understanding faith and also understanding the universe around us.
That's really fascinating. But before we go into that a little bit deeper, I want to track back a little bit. Now, you mentioned that the Quran stresses faith, reason, as an important way of, that the Quran stresses reason as an important tool for understanding the cosmos, and actually the religion itself.
Right.
In your opinion, why is that? Why does the Quran need to stress? I mean, why is it important for a Muslim, for a believer in the Quran, to understand the cosmos? And what does the Quran explain why?
There are a number of examples, and I think it's very interesting. I'm going to read you maybe a couple or three examples to just show you what is the reason behind using reason, which is quite interesting. For example, in Surah 29:43, we have the following verse, a quote: "Those parables we strike them for people so that they may see the truth and mend their ways, but none reasons to understand their true meaning and purpose save the knowledgeable." So you can already see that reason is associated with understanding, with making sense of certain of phenomenon, of making sense of of the universe. And then it goes on, and this is one of some of the next few examples really explain why reason is essential. So we can look and understand the signs, what the scripture calls the sign. He has created the heavens, the earth, with truth, meaningfully and for definite wise purposes, and on solid foundations of truth. In other words, the scripture itself assumes that creation is not haphazard, but it is meaningful. It has a certain meaning, and it is up to man to, in a sense, unravel that meaning, try to make sense of it, try to understand it.
And that comes from the idea that creation is more or less a collection of God's signs to
absolutely.
humanity.
And then the verse, as you anticipated, goes on to say, surely in this is a sign for the believers. And then and there are just so many examples in the Quran about this, but they are all connected to the idea of understanding and perception, but also the fact that reason is needed for us to understand the signs, for us to understand creation, for us to understand the complexity of the universe. So in a sense, I mean, the Quran is not a book of science, definitely not, but it encourages believers to cultivate a scientific understanding of the world. And science is based on reason. That is, it's based on an application of certain principles and methods. Those are the methods that will allow us to make sense of a particular problem or a particular phenomenon in the world.
Because in order to live in this world as a person of faith, you have to learn how to make sense of the world around you, because the world is not simple. The world is not just simply black and white or a few
That's right.
random things thrown out in front of you.
Yes.
So the Quran is more or less telling people, use your reason to be able to understand how to live in this world.
Absolutely, because human beings especially tend to think in terms of binary oppositions. So in a sense, thinking, reflection, meditation, and especially methodical meditation allows believers and human beings to understand the universe in its complexity, but also for them to make sense of their faith. And as I will explain later, I mean, in terms of the examples from the medieval context, that they, through reason, they were able to make sense of their faith to others, especially the Christians and the Jews, because they were involved in debates. And if you are involved in a debate, you have to be absolutely sure that you can explain your story, that you can explain your perspective, and you have to explain your belief system, how it works, and why does it all fit together.
So, in the very beginning of Islam, from the revelation of Quran, there is this emphasis on reason, this call to reason. How did later generations of Muslims, particularly Islamic scholars and jurists, respond to this call?
Right. In fact, from the very beginning, reason, in a sense, was taken quite seriously. And there are two examples for this. The first example is the jurists, and the second example is the philosophers, or what was called the Mu'tazila, a school of philosophers who, in a sense, were influenced by Greek philosophy, but they managed to innovate in philosophy and in so many other disciplines, because most of them were scientists. But I'll come back to that. Let me explain the jurists. I mean, the jurists basically tried to use the fundamental text, the essential text, the primary text, the Quran and the Sunnah, in order to generate rules, to codify and organize society. Of course, these jurists and early theologians, they were very important because they were forming the ummah at that stage. So they played a very important role in not only the intellectual but also the cultural formation of the community.
So by ummah you mean the
Muslim community, the early Muslim community. So for them, the whole task of trying to produce rules and regulations to solve certain problems that have to do with the community was very important. That's why they, for example, came up with the idea of al-ijtihad. Al-ijtihad was very important. That is personal opinion. So if you cannot produce a certain rule, or if you cannot solve a problem, if you cannot solve a legal problem on the basis of the Quran and the Sunnah, if the Quran is not clear about it, the Sunnah is not clear about it, then you have to use your reason. And your reason is a particular process of analogy, for example. They used analogy or other ways of trying to solve a particular issue and trying to produce a particular rule.
Do you have any examples of this?
For example, yes, there is wine is mentioned in the Quran as a prohibited alcoholic beverage, and the early jurists, especially Abu Hanifa. In fact, Abu Hanifa was a very important, the early jurist and rationalist in a sense. He started this exercise of reason on Islamic theology and Islamic texts. On the basis of his judgment of wine, on the basis of that judgment already in the Quran, he managed to also prohibit the other alcoholic beverages. So this is just a very simple example, but there are so many examples to do with the family code, to do with society, to do with so many issues. So the jurists really were interested in an effective organization of society, an effective and a harmonious organization of society. To do that, you need rules, but you need rules that make sense. You need rules that are fair to everyone.
And you also would need rules that would be, I'm sure, would be creative in some ways, because society is constantly evolving.
That's right.
Expanding in different ways.
Absolutely, the rules have to be creative in that sense because of the radical changes that take place. But it's very important to say that this is a very important moment. This is a moment of, you could say, of conversation, where these jurists and theologians were having debates, and they were trying, and they managed to actually solve so many problems. So they actually managed to use reason for the good of society by organizing more effectively society, by solving so many problems. So this is an early stage of a society that is just emerging, and you need intellectuals in some sense. You need legal scholars who can deal with these issues of rights for people, and issues of property distribution, and all these issues have to be resolved very early on. And that's why what's interesting about this formative period is the diversity of opinions among jurists as well as philosophers. And I will talk to you about the example of the philosophers. But jurists did not agree about everything. They were all using reason, but they all came to different conclusions. But that in itself is very important. I think this is why in the Islamic tradition it's very important to realize that from the very beginning there was this conversation of reason and faith together. In other words, these jurists who were believers wanted to solve problems using reason, because they thought that the Quran is telling them you have to use reason in order to make sense of your scripture. So that's what they did. And we ended up with at least 4 schools of interpretation, 4 legal schools of interpretation. I mean, for that age, this is an incredible achievement. You have, I think the main feature of these schools is that you have those who are traditionalists, that is those who depended more on the primary texts and derived their rules from the primary text, and those who were more rationalists and in a sense used more other techniques of reasoning, like al-ijtihad, al-qiyas, and so many other.
Al-qiyas
Al-qiyas is a form, in a sense, is a form of reasoning where you take 2 examples and you try to compare them and see whether they are parallel. So you take one example and you apply it to another example,
so
and you
see
see
analogy.
If you see, right, that helps you. And Abu Hanifa, he was the most rationalist, as I mentioned. He even managed to disagree with everybody at that stage, and came up with the idea of al-istihsan, which is a preference for the public welfare. So al-istihsan, wow. In other words, if we are in trouble, if we cannot solve a problem and so on, we really have to pay attention to the welfare of the public, the welfare of the ummah, of the community. So that comes at the very top. So you see, there are stages of understanding, the stages of reasoning, and stages of solving a legal problem.
So very early on in the Islamic tradition, And what time period are you talking about?
We're talking
this?
about very early 9th century, ninth century, mainly 9th century.
Okay. So very, very early on in the Islamic tradition, for very practical reasons, you have this incredible, vigorous application of reason to the rules and regulations of society, of religion.
Right.
Now, beyond the jurist, and I guess these sort of kind of practical applications of the faith, you mentioned that you also had a lot of philosophical activity.
Absolutely. I mean, the philosophy is another dimension of it. But just before I get into the philosophers, I just would like to add one very important detail, and that is that this debate, this interesting conversation, gave us usul al-fiqh, the sciences of al-fiqh. And so you can imagine this is a whole corpus of scientific inquiry, and that dealt with so many areas of society and of governments, of the state, you could say, of the state itself. So this is in a sense what this debate produced. It produced the sciences, certain sciences, and it's like an institution. Now it's an established institution. It's an institution that allows you to base your reasoning on the primary texts, but also tells you that you need to use your personal opinion or use other techniques to solve particular problem. So going back to your
context.
That's right, for your context, exactly, because the historical context changes all the time. So in a sense, the institution is always fluid and always will require additions and transformation and all sorts of new ideas for it to continue to be effective and for it to continue to do the fundamental job that it was meant for it to do, and that is the organization of society, an effective organization of society. So it produces the internal fluidity in that society.
I think that's very important because a lot of people who may not be familiar with religious jurisprudence, with the whole idea of a religious legal system, have this idea that you have these verses of scripture and then everything is just kind of just black and white and written in stone.
Yes.
But what you're saying, that from the very beginning of the Islamic tradition, people understood that these were things that needed to be not only needed to be interpreted,
yes,
but had to be continually interpreted over time as the conditions of the society would change.
Yes. And this is the link between faith and reason. You do it because you are obedient to God. So it has this what we call doxological reason behind it. You don't do it out of your egotistical needs, but you do it because you already have faith in a transcendent being, and you believe because your knowledge is always limited, you exercise continuous inquiry in order to materialize your faith, and in order to be faithful to the notion, to the Quranic notion, that faith is about understanding what's around you, understanding the universe, understanding the cosmos and its complexity.
Excellent.
But let's not forget the philosophical debate, because that's a very important, important example. And I think, and this is for me, this is the most exciting part of it, because I'm interested in philosophy. And I think in the field of theology and philosophy, what you have, for example, Al-Khalifa al-Ma'mun, who founded Dar al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom. The role of the House of Wisdom is, in a sense, to allow a debate, to allow a conversation. It's all about how do you produce a conversation in a society that is in the process of forming itself. Because that intellectual work, that intellectual exercise helps society evolve and move on, and in a sense help society consolidate its identity, especially in relationship to other identities. Remember that Islam was developing in the Middle East, and it was developing within an Abrahamic context, within a context of other religious traditions, especially Judaism and Christianity.
So at the very beginning, these were lands, these were societies where there was a diversity of beliefs, primarily from the Abrahamic tradition, Judaism, and Christianity.
Yes.
So pretty much Muslims, they weren't living in this
Vacuum.
They weren't living in this vacuum.
No.
There were many other faiths that people were
Yes,
interacting with.
absolutely. They were not in a vacuum. In fact, this is one of the outcome of this marriage between faith and reason, or this attempt, at least, to marry faith and reason, is the fact that it produced diversity, and later it produced a great degree of tolerance. Because think about it: if you're having a debate, if you were a Muslim and you were having a debate with a Christian or with a Jew, you're very likely in a discussion where you also learn about other traditions, and you learn about how to present your own tradition, how to make sense of your own tradition to somebody else who has a completely, perhaps a different belief system, or at least has a different process of argumentation. Because remember, these are Abrahamic traditions. They believe in the same prophets. They have so many things in common, yet the arguments are different for different issues.
Because their way of approaching these common pillars of faith is very different.
Yes, absolutely. So going back to the idea of philosophy, is that around this time we have a school of philosophers called Al-Mu'tazila, who, in a sense, what they did, they tried to appropriate the Greek philosophy, but they also they also created a great innovation in philosophy. So they not only managed to read Plato and Aristotle, but they also produced interpretations and commentaries on these Greek philosophers.
This is really fascinating, but I'm going to have to hold you there for a moment because it's time for us to take a break. Viewers, please stay right with us because we'll be back in only a few minutes with more perspectives on faith. Hello and welcome back to Perspectives on Faith. So, Dr. Yacoubi, we were talking about Islamic philosophers and their take on reason. Can you take us back to the conversation?
Basically, I think Al-Ghazali, a well-known philosopher, said something quite profound, and in a sense that really sums up the mood of the moment and of the period, when he says, reason does not lie. And what he really means is that to understand anything, you really have to use reason. That is, you have to use the accumulation of all those principles that philosophers especially developed. And they developed them by doing two things, as I explained before, by learning from the Greek mythology, methodology of reasoning, but also by bringing in their own analysis and their own reading and their own reasoning. So reason does not lie. You can always rely on it. It is always reliable because it is based on not just reliability or verifiability, that is the presence of evidence, but it is also based on the fact that it is fundamental to faith itself, because faith precedes reason. It comes before reason, and that's the drive for a believer to use reason, and especially for a philosopher or a theologian to use reason. So it's fundamental in that sense, that you need to supplement your faith with an explanation.
Al-Ghazali, as far as I know, is one of the biggest figures in traditional Islamic thought. I find it really fascinating that he would say something like, reason never lies. Could you go in a little bit more detail about that?
Right. Well, before I unpack that, it's very important to note two things. That these philosophers were called al-mutakallimun, and the philosophy they practiced was called al-kalam. Al-kalam is the practice of speech, but more precisely, it's a practice of persuasion and contestation. So that is to be involved in contestation. And contestation means that you have a number of opinions or a number of arguments that you have to test against one another in order to prioritize one, to decide that one is more efficient or more sensible or more sensical than the other. So it's very important to realize that the whole premise of the philosophy practiced is to be involved in an art itself, an art of persuasion, of trying to convince somebody else. And the second point I want to make is that the Mu'tazila were involved, because they were influenced by Greek philosophy, they were involved in one of the most important moments in early Islamic history, and that is translation. They were translating works from Greek heritage into Arabic, which was translated later into Latin. So you could see that they played a fundamental and essential role in the passage or in the translation and the transmission of culture from one cultural context into another. Remember, the point remains that they were not only translators, but they were innovators. They also wrote about these works. They produced commentaries about them. So they were engaged at two levels. At the practical level, that is to translate that heritage into the Islamic context, but also to produce something that is specifically Islamic. And in a sense, that's their humanist contribution.
Humanist contribution, that's a very interesting word that you bring up there. Because I know that very often humanism is something that's associated with Western tradition and not very often connected with the Islamic tradition. Well, what do you have to say about that?
Humanism is the ability to allow conversation to flow. Conversation that will include more than just one argument, but it will include a multiplicity of arguments. So in that sense, Islamic culture produced humanism. That is, it produced the space for people to converse and to exchange ideas and perspectives that were necessarily different. So that's the humanist sensibility. The humanist sensibility, in a sense, is about creating that space of exchange and also of innovation. So once we have the exchange, we're able to move on and produce new knowledge. But fundamentally, that space is a space that continuously produces tolerance and produces the ability of people to listen to one another. So that's why I call it a humanist age. And in fact, this is not new. Many scholars, especially modern scholars, have written about this and have called the age, the early age from the 9th century almost all the way to the 14th century, as an age of Islamic humanism. That is an age that produced possibilities of conversation, possibilities of difference, and possibilities of genuine contestation of ideas, of arguments, and of belief systems.
Now, what are some examples we have from that time period? What are some of the fruits of this Islamic humanistic period?
Well, I can give you just a couple of examples. I mean, Al-Farabi wrote a book called Al-Madina Al-Fadila, and this is a book that tries to explore an ideal. So he is trying to think and reflect about the parameters and the conditions of an ideal city, in a sense an ideal state, where there are basic conditions of tolerance between people, but also where there is a structure, where there is a codification and an organization of society. And of course, this Al-Madina Al-Fadila is based on virtue, or the importance of virtue. Remember, morality is very important, or rather ethics is very important. It's important in the sense, because of what I have explained before, that faith, according to Islamic tradition, precedes reason You begin with faith, and then reason supplements what you already have, because faith concedes that human knowledge is limited. You always say, I don't know. I do not know certain things, even
because you believe in this transcendent reality, beyond your own faculties.
But you believe in that transcendent reality exactly because you are aware of the fact that you don't know everything. And because you don't know everything, that transcendent reality forces you to have something else to help you to make sense of that reality. So that's why faith precedes reason. Reason is a supplement of faith, but it's also a necessity, according to what we explained earlier. It is a necessity. In a sense, it is a scriptural necessity. Now, back to Al-Farabi, and I want to give you a quote here because that will help us with the notion of reason and faith and how they work together. And if I may, I'm just going to summarize one of his major reflections about the relationship between faith and reason. He says, for example, if there is a conflict, if there is a contradiction between scriptural and rational evidence, so if you have one rule that is very contradictory to what you have found in terms of verifiability and in terms of evidence, or scripture and reason, or tradition and reason, or even traditional texts and rational certainties, or what is expressed in similar terms, then he goes on and he gives us a number of alternatives. This is what reason is all about. It's about going through the different alternatives and verifying two things: whether those alternatives are actually verifiable. Can you actually verify them? Number one. Number two, you have to decide whether they are effective. Do they solve the problem by the end of the day? I mean, that is the main thing. So he goes on, let me just, if I may, he goes on, both may be accepted as true, but that is impossible. So look at the kind of logical reasoning. So he says that could be true, but that's impossible. That's impossible because it violates the principle of contradiction. Then second, he goes on to the second principle, or the precept. Both may be rejected as false. You either accept them or you don't accept them. So those are logical possibilities, aren't they? And that is and then he goes on and he concludes that's impossible because it violates the principle of excluded middle. Then he goes on to the third alternative. Scripture may be given priority over reason. So another possibility is to say, look, if there is a contradiction, let's say scripture is right and reason is wrong. And then he goes on to say that, however, is also impossible because reason is the source of scripture. That is, you cannot understand scripture and you cannot understand your own faith if you don't resort to reason. That does not, in a sense, negate faith, but it fortifies faith because those two work together. That is the thing. They work together. There is a fundamental and an inherent relationship and interplay between those two from the very beginning. And then he goes on to say, it is therefore necessary. And then he gives a fourth alternative. Look at the process of reasoning and trying to solve a problem, trying to solve both an intellectual problem as well as a practical problem. And that he goes to give priority to reason and either to interpret scripture allegorically or to entrust its meaning to God. By the end of the day, there is always a solution, and that is that you have to entrust meaning to God, which is a profound statement because it really means that you can always wait to know a meaning of a scripture. It is always open in that sense. And that's why reason is always very, very important to understand in scripture. And that's why these jurists as well as philosophers have linked them to begin with. From the very beginning, they've put them together. They say they're inseparable. You've got to understand scripture in light of reason because a human being needs reason to understand the complexity of the transcendent being, but also the complexity of the world that this transcendent transcendent being has created. So it is in the end, by the end of the day, fundamental to faith.
This really profound understanding that early Islamic scholars, jurists, philosophers reached. How did that continue into later generations? I mean, when we get closer towards the modern age,
Right.
what has been the understanding or response of more contemporary Islamic scholars on this whole discussion of faith and reason?
Right. Well, before I do that, I think it's very important to say that around the 16th century, we start to talk about what we call the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, of course, is an important event in European history, because the Enlightenment is exactly about the priority of reason above anything else. Because in Europe had a very troublesome history of the domination of the church, especially the Catholic Church, which prioritized the interpretation, the official interpretation, at the expense of reason. And I think as a counter culture to that, what happened, we have, after the Reformation, we have the Enlightenment, and we have the key figures of the Enlightenment who emphasized one important point, that we cannot, the idea of relying entirely on faith, or relying entirely on a singular interpretation that is given to us by the Catholic Church, is not sustainable anymore, because we need to depend on reason. And reason is it is the application of certain principles to understand God himself and to understand the universe. So the Enlightenment is a very important moment, but the Enlightenment itself depended on the centrality of reason. So that's why it's very important to stress that reason in itself is not new. Because there is a view that reason somehow developed with the Enlightenment, but that's not true, as we have just discussed. I think the Enlightenment stressed the importance of reason, and then we have to look at the Enlightenment within its kind of European historical context. Spinoza. Let me just talk about Spinoza, who was writing quite early on in the 16th century. Spinoza is one of the very first European philosophers who started to in a sense debunk the problems of religious singularity. That is, that there is only one meaning to the Bible, for example, and he started to criticize those views that said that you can only understand the Bible in one particular way. And this is really why the Enlightenment, in a sense, took hold in the history of Europe. It's because there was so much repression of, in a sense, a multiplicity of views and a multiplicity of understandings of the Bible.
Which, as I understand it, is very different from how we've been discussing what was happening in the earlier periods in Islamic history, where from the very beginning you had this, I guess, a certain pluralism of ideas,
yes,
and a very vigorous amount of contestation when it came to different philosophical and theological ideas.
Yes.
So I guess pretty much what you're saying is, because Islam and Christianity in their development have very different histories, they have approached this issue of reason in different ways.
That's right, in different ways. But the most important event that we need to really bear in mind is, by the 19th century, most of the Islamic world, if not all of it, was under European domination. And I think, in a sense, the Enlightenment is very important to stress that the Enlightenment had two dimensions. It had the territorial dimension, that is the experience of colonialism, which happened, during the.
Which is really fascinating, because when most people think of the Enlightenment, they think of these ideas of, the universal value of man,
Yes.
and all of these very kind of enlightened values.
Yes.
But at the same time, it was the heyday of colonialism.
That's right, because the Enlightenment is a paradoxical experience and a paradoxical event. The Enlightenment, when we think of the Enlightenment, we think of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we think of Hegel, we think of Kant, we think of these pioneers of enlightened ideas who said that the fundamental notion that we need to grasp is twofold. One, that man should be liberated and man should be able to exercise his ability to understand independently without the intervention of religious institutions. So that was a very important premise of the Enlightenment. It's important to think for yourself. No one is going to read the Bible for you. You read the Bible for yourself. You make your own understanding, your own interpretations of the Bible. So you are part of the story, part of the biblical story. So that's a breakthrough. And the second point is that with the Enlightenment, with the ideas that were produced, new ventures opened, and in a sense, the European man wanted to explore other parts of the world, and this is where the paradox lies. That even though we have all these great ideas of individualism and of independent thinking and of respect for the ability of man to think for himself, we also have, in an institutional sense, we have the other side of the Enlightenment, and that is the territorial side, the colonial side, when very enlightened statesmen and so on also said that that they needed, in a sense, to go out and spread those ideas, if even by force, if need be, because those ideas were essentially universal. So therefore, other people needed them, and that's what we have later in the 19th century of the French idea of la mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. That is, because of the Enlightenment, because of our experience, and the Enlightenment gave a number of other things. The Enlightenment it gave modernity and modernization and a very rapid process of industrialization. But that happened also because of the second part of the Enlightenment, and that is the European's obsession, the European man's obsession with exploring the other parts of the world that, in a sense, the European needed to translate those ideas, to give some sense and some flesh and some reality, to the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, but in one word, the Enlightenment is a paradoxical concept as well as a paradoxical event.
Well, I think perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of it is the idea of people thinking that, okay, we have to spread civilization, but at the same time being blind to the fact that these people they were trying to civilize were already civilized. They had their own civilizations, they had their own values, they had their own systems, their own intellectual heritages.
Yes.
And in what way, do you think that has influenced just general Western attitudes about Islam and the whole relationship of faith and reason?
Yes. Well, there are 2 points there. I think the relationship between the Islamic world and Christendom, to begin with, started more or less, I think, with the Crusades. I think the Crusades played a very damaging role in the way Westerners perceived Muslims and the way Muslims perceived Westerners, or let's say Christians at that time. But by the 19th century, you also have the continuation of that stereotypical view of Muslims as barbaric, as backward, but also as violent, and that comes from the Crusades. But by the 19th century, when we have the colonization of these Islamic lands, we have this more or less the same notion, and therefore it was very hard for for Muslims and Westerners to build a relationship based on equality. And I think that was the problem, because colonialism was not based on equality. It is a relationship of domination, and it is a relationship based on an inferior part and a superior part. And I think that was the fundamental problem when things exacerbated, the relationship exacerbated between Muslims and then Westerners.
That makes me think of actually one group of, I don't know what you would call them precisely, but maybe it was a sort of group of, or maybe a sort of intellectual movement in the West known as Orientalism.
Right.
And which more or less articulated this sense of inferiority, or this sense of inequality, the sense that we have this Western or Occidental tradition, and then we have an Oriental tradition which is inherently inferior, and I guess a sort of whole intellectual movement in a way of sort of trying to prove that in a way.
Right.
What are your reflections on Orientalism and how it has affected understanding between Islamic traditions and Western tradition?
That's a very good question. I think it's very important to define what Orientalism is in very simple terms. It is an institution that produces knowledge about the East or the Islamic world. So by the 19th century, Europe is the most powerful force in the world, and by more or less the end of the 19th century or mid-19th century, Europe was colonizing 85% of the globe. So it was so powerful, and Europe divided up the different parts of the world among them. So it's very important to note two things. Number one, that this relationship is based on physical violence, or on domination, on the actual territorial domination of the Islamic world. And secondly, it was also a cultural domination. In other words, and I think that's what you're getting at, the production of knowledge is about culture. That is, when you colonize a place, you have to produce certain knowledge about that place. You have to explain what it means to justify why you are actually colonizing the place. So Europe, by and large, justified its colonialism by the very knowledge that it produced about the Islamic world being backward and being uncivilized. In a sense, you're absolutely right. So what was happening is a total amnesia about the humanist period that we were talking about. In other words, the Europeans were not interested in finding out the contributions, for example. Especially, I'm talking specifically here about the colonial officers and so on. They were not interested in the contributions of Muslims, because they are interested in dominating the place. But we have Orientalists, that is Western scholars, who wrote about the East or the Islamic world, who wrote about the languages, the customs, the ideas, the histories, the cultures of the Islamic world. The point is, despite the humanist, despite the humanist contribution to the scholarship on Islam, one very important streak that many scholars have noted is the fact that the way they have perceived the Islamic world, the way they have represented the Islamic world, was always based on this dichotomy, or rather this relationship of domination. In other words, when you read Orientalists, by and large, you read about an Islamic world that is fundamentally a problem that has to be solved. And just to explain that what marked this encounter between the Islamic world and Europe is the invasion of Napoleon Bonaparte. It really started the encounter between the East and the West, or the Islamic world and Europe. And when Bonaparte went to Egypt for the first time, he took with him, or brought with him, an Arabic press and scientists, anthropologists, linguists, and so on. So he was not just interested in the territorial invasion of the place, he was interested in knowing the place, in producing knowledge about the place, in making sense, in a sense, intellectually of the place, and in the end, in producing statements about this place. This place is backward, right, or this place is not backward, etc. So that is the fundamental, I suppose, purpose of Orientalism, and that is to produce a knowledge about a place in order to facilitate its domination. And this has been articulated especially by the Palestinian American scholar Edward Said when he published his book in 1978 called Orientalism. And it's a critique of all those practices of mainly 19th century Orientalism.
So that's where the picture was. There was this picture of colonization, inequality between the Islamic world and the West. But now we're living in a very different age. There's much more information, much more exchange. Just briefly, I guess to kind of conclude our whole conversation.
Right.
What does the picture look like today? And what might be some of your recommendations for better dialogue and better understanding between these two traditions?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me make 2 points. The first thing is, despite the stereotypical views that were produced out of Orientalism, I think you could say that we have moved on. We haven't moved on. That doesn't mean that stereotypes actually have stopped, but there is a discussion about them, that there is a debate about the roots of those stereotypes and what are the best ways to counter them, to change them, to correct them. And there are many scholars who have written extensively about that. Obviously, the debate, in a sense, was cultivated by the book that Edward Said published in 1978. That is the first point. The second point, I think there are Muslim scholars today, like Muhammad Arkoun, Al-Jabiri, and many others, who are trying, in a sense, to take us back to the importance of that debate of faith and reason. In other words, they're grappling with the same question that Al-Ghazali was grappling with, or Al-Jahid was grappling with, but they're trying to talk about it within the exigencies of the time, the limitations and the circumstances of our modern context. And more importantly, by the 19th century, even though colonialism, in a sense, was dominant in the Islamic consciousness, it is very important to bear in mind that even around that time, there was a huge debate with early Muslim scholars like Muhammad Abdu, for example, At-Tahtawi, Qasim Amin, and many others, who tried to, in a sense, do two things. The first thing is to solve a problem, very much like the way the jurists and the philosophers were trying. And the problem is, can we reconcile modernity and Islam, or Islamic tradition? And if that is the case, what are the ways to do it? In a sense, what is the process of reasoning to solve that problem? Because it is a problem, because modernity has destabilized Islamic societies, and there is a problem that we need to fix, and this question is still going on. People are still offering suggestions and reflections about it. Now, the second thing that these thinkers are trying to do is trying to think in terms of how do we, in a sense, look at what we have so far and try to reconcile not just Islamic reason with itself, but also Islamic reason and the Enlightenment, and also with the larger picture. How do we reconcile and how do we fix this miscomprehension between the Islamic world and the Western world? So I think it's very important to be positive and optimistic that because of what's going on, it is possible to think that we may go back to another debate, another humanist debate. But I think for that to happen, we need what I would call a leakage We need for this debate to leak everywhere. It has to leak in our society everywhere. And I think this is a program that reflects or tries, attempts to allow that to happen. That viewers can listen to us, and in a sense they can perhaps think, maybe we should think about this. Maybe I should read these medieval texts and make sense of my faith, or or try to understand what reason is, and so on. So this idea of leakage, we need to allow this debate to affect and change different parts of our society, but mainly change us. So again, one is able to make sense of one's faith, if one has one, and one is able to also listen to the other. Again, the point is, we need to go back to a humanist sensibility, a sensibility where we can have a conversation. And a conversation is based on tolerance and especially the willingness to listen. So I think, just to sum up very quickly, I think that the fact that we are trying to be post-Orientalist, in the sense that we're trying to correct and we're trying to face those stereotypes with scholarly work and with reflection, number one. And number two, the fact that there are thinkers from within the Islamic tradition, as well as thinkers from within the Western tradition, that are trying to build a new perspective. That means that there is that possibility, even though things look very bleak, but primarily because we miss the point. And the point that we miss is the fact that the basis of our discussion should not be about whether one is right and the other is wrong, but the basis of our conversation should be conversation itself.
Well, with that, I have to thank you very much, Dr. Yacoubi. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I hope that our viewers at home will have benefited as much as I have.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, that's all for this edition of Perspectives on Faith. Please join us again next time. Until then, you can always find more information about the program or watch old episodes on our website at www.ebru.tv. Thank you.